Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we'll return once more to a festive favourite with a detailed look at the famous 1914 Christmas Truce. We'll explore the timeline of that day, what took place, and examine that unique episode through the words of one man who was there. Well, hello Dan. Always pleased to be joining you on the podcast and a special festive episode, since we are recording this in December as we speak. And although listeners, you can't see me, I can assure you I'm wearing a wonderful Christmas sweater for this particular episode. But it's a great episode because it's going to be revisiting a topic we've covered in the past, which is the Christmas Truce. But I think with a topic like the Christmas Truce, Dan, where there's just so much written about it, it's ingrained in certainly British culture. There's memorials to this event on the Western Front. It's such a big event, it's impossible not to be drawn to it every Christmas.
It's one of those, the gifts that keep on giving in a certain sense. And I know there are people within the First World War community who are going to be slightly cringing when they hear the words Christmas Truce yet again for another year. But the truth is, there's loads to explore. We're only talking about a 24-hour period of trench warfare here. More realistically, probably a 5 or 6 hour period during the hours of daylight. But actually, if you break that down, and I think what's fascinating about it is you do get a snapshot of what's happening up and down the line at one moment on one day in this very large and complex war. And so from that point of view, to actually cover the Christmas Truce, I think is really interesting. And to do it in a different way, Spence, something that we've not really tried before, which is in effect through the eyes of one man. Now, not exclusively, but you couldn't go too far wrong in picking the guy that we have today because, one, he's a beautiful writer and actually really puts across his experiences very well. Secondly, he goes on to become something of a household name in post-war Britain. And that, of course, Spence, our hero of today is going to be none other than Bruce Bairnsfather.
And what a great character Captain Bruce Bairnsfather, as he becomes, actually is. A prominent humorist and cartoonist who really becomes famous in the First World War. He's a soldier in the First World War. That's why he's at the Christmas Truce. But what he becomes famous for is illustrating scenes from the First World War with this long-running and oft imitated but never bettered character that's known as Old Bill, who's this curmudgeonly old campaigner. He's got a big walrus moustache. He's usually wearing a balaclava. And he's full of sardonic and rather cynical humor. And he captures something, I think, of the old soldier or the grizzled old veteran. And these cartoons are really a publishing sensation in the First World War. And the number one fan base that Bairnsfather has is actually other soldiers. And they recognize something in what Bairnsfather is producing. There's a truth in these cartoons, which the soldiers love. Interestingly enough, Dan, back home in Britain, and indeed in the wider civilian empire, there's actually some complaints. There's some letters to various people. There's complaints to his publishers saying that these cynical cartoons, which don't just always feature Old Bill, but they usually feature a certain amount of cynicism, that they rather besmirch the reputation of the British Army. I don't think that's true. I think there's a wonderful truth in these cartoons that it's the reason they're so incredibly popular. And the fact that Bairnsfather goes on to have an absolutely fabulously long career, works through the post-war era, and then in the Second World War, he actually becomes the official cartoonist to American forces in Europe. And his illustrations be found in Stars and Stripes and Yank, the official magazines. And he also draws cartoons that go on nose art for aircraft. So he has an immense career, always popular with soldiers. I don't think the criticism that his soldiers are cynical in any way is a valid one. I think he recreates what he sees.
Yeah, I think I agree with you in a sense there. I mean, the criticism that soldiers are cynical. I mean, truth is, soldiers are cynical at that time. So I don't think he's misrepresenting them. I agree with what you're saying from that point of view. Absolutely. He's, we should say to the viewers out there as well, if you're not familiar with Bairnsfather's work, by all means, check out Fragments from France, which is his kind of the set, if you like, of Old Bill that comes about. Actually starts, I think he he draws the very first one just about Christmas 1914, about 100 yards away from where we're going to be discussing the action of the truce. He even marks it down on a little map. So if you haven't checked it out yet, do check out Bruce Bairnsfather. Maybe we can get Linus, our technical wizard, to make a Bairnsfather cartoon part of the artwork for this week's episode. But Spence, of course, we need to get to Christmas first, and we've covered this once before, but it's always important to do so. Let's just set the scene as to what's really been going on in the lead up to the Christmas truce of 1914, because it's important to understand in order to understand why there's a truce at all.
Absolutely right, Dan. And what's happened is we've had several months of intense combat in 1914, from the German invasion of Belgium and France in August, the Allied counterattack at the Battle of the Marne in September, then certainly the British Army shifting into Flanders alongside French and Belgian and indeed Indian forces, trying to fight towards Brussels, but actually being hit with this huge German offensive aiming at the Channel ports instead, that comes to centre around the Belgian town of Ypres. Battle of Ypres, First Ypres, is proportionately the bloodiest battle the British Army fights on the Western Front for the entire First World War. The army's small, takes huge amounts of casualties. The line just about holds, an incredible defensive action. Not only British, of course, Indian, Belgian, and French troops also involved, but for the British Army, this is a really definitive moment to the First World War. Battle comes to an end around about mid-November. Both sides totally exhausted, massive casualties. The French army suffered close to 1 million casualties, perhaps more than 1 million in 4 months. The German army has suffered somewhere in the region of 675,000 casualties. British army, much smaller, has suffered 95,000 casualties, but that's coming from a much smaller base. The total size of the British army in 1914, when the war begins, is about 249,000 men. So huge proportion of fallen casualties. All sides exhausted. They dig in front of one another, and the Western Front has completely formed by the end of November. Trenches from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. And within this, it's important to remember that the British Army actually holds a very small sector. The vast majority of the front at this stage of the war is French-held, Belgians to the north, British and Indian troops are occupying really this Flanders front, largely where they've ended the Battle of Ypres. The fighting, though, although the major battles have ended by mid-November, the fighting hasn't ended in this sector, has it, Dan? It's actually, there's quite a lot of vicious, small actions go on in this period.
Yeah, there are a number of them actually, and what the Germans would term the Decemberschlacht, December fight. And they're going to be really crucial in terms of understanding the bigger picture. Just going to go back for a second, Spence, to a stat that you just reeled off there, which I think is worth repeating to a certain extent. The French, by the end of 1914, have suffered 1 million casualties. The entire British army on the Western Front at that time is 1/4 of the size of all of the casualties that the French have suffered. And it's so crucial to keep that in context. You know, of course, we look at this through British eyes, and if you were to go and ask somebody in Britain who the biggest player in the First World War was, of course, they're going to say Britain. Absolutely untrue in 1914. We are a very small army. And as a result, this 400-mile stretch of the Western Front, British hold 30 miles of it. So a very small area. That being said, it's an active area as well, because we see a number of different fights running from about the 12th of December up to about the 19th in areas that the British occupy, particularly around the old or soon-to-be very famous battlefield of Neuve Chapelle. We're going to see another one up just outside a place called Ploegstert or Plug Street Wood, going to be famous for the truce, in an area known as the Birdcage, which is a kind of salient that sticks out into the line. We're going to see another bit further to the north around Messines, and south of there, a place called Wieschater, also known to Tommy as White Sheets. So there are going to be a number of different actions in and around that area. Also, another one that's worth mentioning is going to be in December of 1914, the first mass use of mine charges on the Western Front. We're going to see about 20 different mine charges explode underneath Givenchy at the very southern end of the British line, killing a number of Gurkhas. So it has been active. I think the other thing to mention here, Spence, as well, is that whilst most of these have been British-led assaults, they've also been extremely bloody. And as we approach Christmas 1914, one of the more morbid elements that would have been seen out on the Western Front was a lot of these lads' mates lying in no man's land, only a handful of yards away, but unable to be reached and brought in.
This is really true. The shape of no man's land at this stage is still taking form, and the trenches in a lot of sectors, including the British sector, have formed almost organically. this is not necessarily people or armies selecting the best offensive terrain and digging in. As you'll see in parts of the Western Front, this is really two exhausted forces just digging in wherever they've ended. And what that means is there are the dead of, in some cases from First Eve, weeks earlier, are still lying out in no man's land. There are the recent dead from this bitter fighting, these small scale but very bitter actions of December. And whereas in 15, 16, 17, there's a better system for patrolling no man's land, for entering no man's land, and so forth. 1914, that doesn't exist. And though there are some informal truces to recover the dead, and they're becoming a little more common by the end of 1914, they're not standard. We know, as historians now, as more than a century later, that the serious fighting has finished by December 1914. But the armies at the time don't know this. They don't know if there's going to be another major offensive. And of course, there's all these small, vicious little actions going on too. So nobody wants to venture out into no man's land to recover these dead. And of course, that's very, very emotive, especially in 1914. And despite the enormous casualties we've just mentioned, especially for the French army, there's still an urge, a natural soldierly urge to recover and bury your dead. And the sight of your dead comrades, and they're not just abstract comrades, these are often your friends who've fallen in these small actions, perhaps even fallen weeks earlier. You can perhaps see their body in no man's land, but you can't go and get it because no man's land is too dangerous, too many bullets flying across it. That's very, very troubling for the soldiers. They're desperate to go and recover their fallen, who are almost within easy distance, but of course they're covered by all this gunfire. And so it's a real problem that's eroding morale. It's making the soldiers unhappy. And what's adding to their misery is, and I know we've mentioned this a number of times on the podcast before, I don't think we can mention it enough to get across, and that's how awful the weather conditions are in 1914.
It's extremely grim. And I think the thing that really underscores this, there's a difference between this extremely grim weather in the winter of 1917-18 compared to extremely grim weather in the winter of 1914. And the difference is the quality and the state of the trenches. Because in 1914, there are no A-frame, duck-boarded, well-revetted, drainage system fitted trenches. You don't get any of that. You get a hole in the ground with some poor bloke standing in it. It's really rudimentary stuff. And as a result, quite regularly, these guys are going to find themselves knee deep in mud and then waist deep in water. And so it's an extraordinarily awful condition to be in, particularly for any sustained period of time. Now imagine doing that in 0 or 1 degree temperatures with a very cold morning frost and, just stuff sticking around that can cause you damage, bit of metal sticking out of a trench. It hurts a hell of a lot more when you're cold. You ever whack your hand on something when your hand's freezing cold or anything like that? It just makes the whole situation much more grim. We also remember in the formative days of trench warfare as well. So the systems that are in place, things like trench rotation, they're not as well established at this point. Rations are not coming up as regularly. All of these kind of things that make life that little more bearable 2 or 3 years into the war, they're not really established. And so if you combine that with the fact there have been very unsuccessful attacks over the previous days and weeks, you, I guess, literally combine that with the smell as a result of that and any number of other things, it just makes it a really awful position to be in. And now when you kind of look down that road a little ways and you see Christmas approaching in 1914, and this is true of both sides. If it's true of all sides, we should say, because it's true in the French sector, it's true in the Belgian sector, and various other locations. But there is just a feeling that, hang on, let's just have a break and let's try and make the best of the scenario. And there's a point to be made here, actually. Whilst we are talking about a truce between enemies, actually the initial, if you like, the seeds of that Christmas truce are really formed within each nation's army at that time. The Brits are going to try and have a decent time amongst other Brits. The Germans are going to do the same. This is going to cross those boundaries, but initially it's Company A speaking to Company C, and the officers are going to get together and share a bottle of brandy or something. These kind of things, Spence, they kind of evolve and develop during that time.
They do, and I think one of the reasons they evolve and develop is because people are unhappy. This is a grim time to be at the front. And in fact, after the war has ended, in the British press, there's frequently letters to and from the press about who had it hardest. as a soldier in the First World War. And people say, well, the Somme was bad. Well, Third Ypres was worse. Well, the German Spring Offensive was worse than that. And one letter that's guaranteed to trump everybody is soldiers who were around in 1914, especially this winter. As you say, Dan, freezing cold. It rains constantly. The trenches don't have proper drainage systems. They don't have duckboards. So you're quite literally occupying a trench ankle deep in mud, sometimes knee or even waist deep in freezing cold rainwater. The system of reliefs doesn't really work, doesn't exist. The trenches are constantly falling in because they're muddy and wet. You don't have the hot ration parties that become standard in the later part of the First World War. You don't have dugouts where you might have a little bit of a heating in there. You don't have your own stoves to make food. It is appalling. It's like the worst, most nightmarish camping trip you can imagine, if that's not too glib. And yet within this, I think soldiers, the sheer desperation of the situation forces soldiers to start thinking about, well, it is Christmas. And I think this goes back to Bairnsfather himself, that soldiers are cynical, especially in circumstances like this. Often the only thing you can do to keep your morale up is laugh about it. And one thing that starts to appear is, as you say, Dan, informal ideas about, well, we're going to try and do something for Christmas, whatever that may be. And in the circumstances, there's very little you can do for Christmas. But there's ideas about this. As you say, well, somebody's managed to get hold of a bottle of something. We're going to open it on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. Somebody's managed to get hold of some good tobacco. Somebody managed to acquire a goose or a turkey or a good-sized chicken. Little things like this, very informal. It's just almost a way of retaining some sort of spirit and humanity. And something to remember on top of this, listeners, is this is the first Christmas of the war. War, of course, go through multiple Christmases. This is the first one. The summer enthusiasm has faded away. And although not everybody at this stage thinks the war is going to be as long and bloody as it is, it's quite clear the war has not turned out as many expected. It's been incredibly violent, incredibly bloody. And now the armies are just exhausted and occupying as part of the front they never really anticipated. And so in this, I think the mindset is a little bit different. And it's that mindset, that desire to, well, we've got to do something to try and raise our spirits, that's going to lead ultimately to the Christmas truce.
Well, you can see we've been approaching it. Let's get stuck into that story and let's go straight into it. And just for those that are not aware of Bruce Bairnsfather, let's just point out here. So he's a very interesting character, actually. So he's born in India. He's from a military family, and he's expected to go in at officer level to join the British Army, and is going to make his career in the British Army. He's also, of course, a very talented artist, and this is kind of his second love. Things don't work out for him, though. He's not particularly studious, doesn't do that well at school, and he actually fails his Sandhurst entry exams. So military life is off the table for him, really, in 1912. And he then goes on to start studying art. And in fact, doesn't do particularly well at that either, which is quite shocking given his later reputation. And eventually gives that up in favor of becoming, I think, an electrical engineer for a period of time. All of that changes, though, in 1914 when Bairnsfather's still a young man and he gets a second bite at the military cherry because all of a sudden this idea of not having Sandhurst education and not quite getting through the exams, well, Great Big World War comes along, those are relaxed a bit, and he eventually earns himself a commission in the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and it's with them that he's going to find himself in December of 1914 out in a little area known as Ploegstert, or called Ploegstert, known to British troops as Plug Street. And this is going to turn out to be a fairly quiet area of the front line, although in 1914 that's not the case. But that's the scene set for our location for Bruce Bairnsfather. We can pick up his story, Spence, on the 24th of December, where he starts to discuss that period of time.
We can, and listeners, this is going to be really the heart of this episode. Bruce Bairnsfather's own words are considered a highly reliable witness of this, given the duration of his career, and a beautiful writer as well. So Bruce Bairnsfather remembered Christmas Eve, 1914, and he remembered it like this. The dawn of the 24th brought a perfectly still, cold, frosty day. The spirit of Christmas began to permeate us all. We tried to plot ways and means of making the next day, Christmas, different in some way to others. Invitations from one dugout to another for sundry meals were beginning to circulate. Christmas Eve was, in the way of weather, everything that Christmas Eve should be. I was billed to appear at a dugout about a quarter of a mile to the left that evening to have a rather special thing in trench dinners. Not quite so much bully and McConaughey about as usual. A bottle of red wine and a medley of tinned things from home deputised in their absence. The day had been entirely free from shelling, and somehow we all felt that the Boches too wanted to be quiet. There was a kind of an invisible, intangible feeling extending across the frozen swamp between the two lines, which said, "This is Christmas Eve for both of us. Something in common." And I think that quote there, Dan, just captures something of what we've been talking about. This informal desire to do something for Christmas, even in circumstances as grim as 1914. And the fact that Brian's father refers to a bottle of red wine and a medley of tinned things from home is going to be the Christmas dinner, I think is significant. But also that there's a mood, there's a sense that, well, maybe the Germans have got it just as bad. And largely they have, I think, that.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to consider it, actually. And of course, if we flip over to the other side of the lines, it's important to remember as well that traditionally, Christmas in most of continental Europe and Germany included is going to be celebrated on the evening of Christmas Eve, so the 24th of December, as opposed to the morning of the 25th, which is more of the British thing. We see this start to appear from the Germans. So if you read any accounts really of the Christmas truce, most of those overtures for peace that are seen are actually seen from the German side and typically on the evening of the 24th. And we see almost a uniformity, certainly in this in parts of this 30-mile sector, where the Germans are going to be, if you like, putting the feelers out for a bit of peace the following day. And depending on how the British opposite them are going to react is really going to dictate what goes on in that particular sector on that particular day. The kind of things that we see are little fir trees getting stuck up on top of the trenches, lanterns being hoisted above the front lines over their own trenches as well. Both of which are actually, you wouldn't see later on because it's actually not a very good idea to directly identify your trench line. But we are going to see this. The Germans are really leading, and what we see first of all is much like we've discussed already, is singing on the German lines, and that singing is going to be really Germans singing to Germans. And they're going to be just enjoying themselves, trying to keep warm, trying to get by as best they can. But of course, with trench lines not that wide, it's no great surprise that actually we're going to see that the British are going to start engaging in that scenario as well. Now, just a quick point before we get to that, it's worth pointing out that in certain instances, those overtures for peace are rebuffed. We have covered this before, but I can't skip past it without mentioning it. Certain areas, such as the southern part of the British line, in the area occupied by the 4th Guards Brigade, they are going to see the same thing. They're going to see lanterns stuck up across no man's land. They're going to hear singing drifting across. And one instance I'm thinking of, a man by the name of Corporal Clifford Lane, H Company First Hearts. He famously records his experiences of the Christmas truce. In fact, he writes into the Imperial War Museum in the 1980s about the time of the Falklands War because he'd never heard of the Christmas truce before. This gives you some kind of idea. He says, I was in the trenches Christmas 1914. Nobody at that time, and for the following 60 years, nobody ever said to me, what was this Christmas truce about? He said, as far as I was concerned, it didn't happen. We saw the Germans hoist some lanterns on Christmas Eve 1914. Officer of the guards comes along and tells us to shoot at them. We did. Germans brought the lantern down. That was the end of it. It's quite incredible when you think about it, Spence. It's certainly not universal.
No, it's not. And one thing also to just get across is it's not universal across the Western Front either. It's not a uniquely British experience, but it's a predominantly British and German experience. There are some truces between French and German forces elsewhere on the front in Christmas 1914. But it's important to bear in mind that the attitude between the French and the Germans is extraordinarily hostile in 1914. Germany's invaded France, over 1 million French casualties, hundreds of thousands of French civilians displaced or now trapped behind German lines. Yes, there are some truces, but it's not on the same scale as the British and German truces. Fortunately, a lot more British troops will participate in these truces and French troops will participate at the same time. So the war is still going on. It's not just Clifford Lane and the guards blasting away in parts of the front. There's still going to be fighting, especially between the French and the Germans. I think it's worth picking up now from where Bairnsfather is stationed with the Royal Warwicks, because we want to sort of do a little bit of a countdown about, well, what's happening. And we've already heard Bairnsfather's account of what it's like on Christmas Eve. Very cold and still and frosty. No action. The Germans aren't shooting on his sector. The British aren't shooting back. And right about 10 p.m. on the Plug Street sector, Bairnsfather and his comrades start to hear singing coming from the German trenches for the first time. And it's worth relating. It's a long account, but it really captures something of what it must have been like at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve on this front. So Bairnsfather tells us this. About 10 p.m., I made my exit from the convivial dugout on the left of our line and walked back to my own lair. On arriving at my own bit of trench, I found several of the men standing about, and all very cheerful. There was a good bit of singing and talking going on. Jokes and jibes on our curious Christmas Eve, as contrasted with any former one, were thick in the air. One of my men turned to me and said, "You can hear 'em quite plain, sir." "Hear what?" I inquired. "The Germans over there, sir. Hear 'em singing and playing on a band or something." I listened. Away out across the field, among the dark shadows beyond, I could hear the murmur of voices, and an occasional burst of some unintelligible song would come floating out on the frosty air. The singing seemed to be loudest and most distinct a bit to our right. I popped into my dugout and found the platoon commander. "Do you hear the Boches kicking up that racket over there?" I said. "Yes," he replied. "They've been at it some time." "Come on," I said. "Let's go along the trench to the hedge there on the right. That's the nearest point to them, over there." So we stumbled along our now hard, frosted ditch and, scrambling up onto the bank above, strode across the field to our next bit of trench to the right. Everyone was listening. An improvised Bosch band was playing a precarious version of Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, at the conclusion of which some of our mouth organ experts retaliated with snatches of ragtime songs and imitations of the German tune. Suddenly we heard a confused shouting from the other side. We all stopped to listen. The shout came again. A voice in the darkness shouted in English with a strong German accent, "Come over here." A ripple of mirth swept along our trench, followed by a rude outburst of mouth organs and laughter. Presently, in a lull, one of our sergeants repeated the request, "Come over here." "You come halfway, I come halfway," floated out of the darkness. Well, anyway, after much suspicious shouting and jocular derision from both sides, our sergeant went along the hedge, which ran at right angles to the two lines of trenches. He was quickly out of sight, but, as we all listened in breathless silence, we soon heard a spasmodic conversation taking place out there in the darkness. Presently, the sergeant returned. He had with him a few German cigars and cigarettes, which he exchanged for a couple of McConaughey's and a tip of Catstan, which he had taken with him. The séance was over, but had given just the requisite touch to our Christmas Eve, something a little human and out of the ordinary routine. After months of vindictive sniping and shelling, this little episode came as an invigorating tonic and a welcome relief to the daily monotony of antagonism. And Dan, I think that it's a great quote. It's a long quote, but listeners, I'm sure you'll agree that it's one that's worth hearing because it captures just this mood, this slightly surreal mood. You might even say a slightly magical mood. There's clearly something in the air. There's a sense of the unreal about this. And I note Bairnsfather's comment about soldiers talking about this is the strangest Christmas Eve I've ever had. Whether they celebrated it with the army in barracks or in civilian life, it would have been very unique. And the informal nature of it, from the Germans singing and playing music to the British responding with their mouth organs to this totally informal meet me halfway discussion and a little bit of an exchange. And of course, this is actually Christmas Eve rather than Christmas Day itself. But this is the first inklings of what will become the Christmas Truce.
Absolutely. And there's something really interesting about that particular Bairnsfather account. And I think the very last sentence sums it up really well, actually. When I'll just repeat it. After months of vindictive sniping and shelling, this little episode came as an invigorating tonic and a welcome relief to the daily monotony of antagonism. I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it any better at all. He's really talking about that, the idea that all of this horror that he's seen up until now, particularly since the establishment of trench warfare, it's just that desire for a break. Let's just have a break from it all. And clearly it's felt on both sides. clearly felt in a lot of places up and down the line. And so, interestingly as well, that we can maybe discuss it later about how this feeling probably isn't there in 1915, 16, or 17, but certainly is still there in 1914. And as a result, we're going to see this unique series of events unfold. And I think they are that. They're a series of events rather than one event, because it's a very different story in different parts of the line. But there is this kind of unifying factor that everybody's just had a really tough time. Of course, the weather's freezing cold. It's not a white Christmas, but it's very frosty. The ground's frozen. It's just an awkward situation. And really, by the time Ben's father finishes his account, he leaves it probably around midnight on just about ticking over to Christmas Day here. We know from most accounts there's actually another period of silence, and that period of silence is really going to last until about dawn. And everybody along the Western Front is desperately waiting for dawn, because freezing cold, pitch black, and bear in mind, it is absolutely pitch black. We need to just add that in. If you imagine yourself sitting in a ditch in, waist deep in water on Christmas Eve, you need to close your eyes because you're not seeing a thing at all. There's no lights to show or anything like that. It's a really horrible situation. But those first rays of sunlight bring that first little glimmer of warmth as well, and it's the sign of a new day and perhaps a chance to start moving about again. But it's just incredible, Spencer. Ben's father paints an incredible picture there, and he also mentions something which I think is much overlooked when it comes to the story of the truce. And we're talking, of course, about frontline soldiers. What's really interesting, and it's possibly the first day for quite some time it's not happened. And if you read any account about the truce here, it's really rare that you see any reference to it. No artillery fire at all up and down the line that day. That's extremely rare and probably very, very welcome.
No doubt about it, because we paint a very strong picture, I think, about how miserable conditions are in the trenches. Cold, wet, facilities limited, to say the very least. A battle against the elements as much as it is against the enemy. And then on top of that, if you have you've been carefully trying to improve your trench, and suddenly a German 5.9 shell, high explosive shell, hits it, and not only is it going to inflict casualties, it's also going to wreck all your work and cause this chaos. And this is a period of the war as well where the Royal Artillery has effectively been silenced because there's just no ammunition. The guns are being rationed to maybe 2 or 3 rounds a day at this stage, which they carefully hoard just in case there's a major action that needs their support. The Germans are also having some ammunition supply problems, but they're minor compared to the British. And so from a British perspective, the British soldier is being shelled pretty regularly, not intense bombardments, nothing like the bombardments you'll see later in the war. But if you're under them, pretty wretched. And given that the front lines are crude, they don't offer the protection they do later in the war, they're often quite densely packed because the trench system hasn't been fully built yet. It's grim to be shelled. And this shelling kills and wounds indiscriminately as well. And for the British soldiers to endure this, knowing their own guns can't strike back, just adds to the misery of all this as well. And so to have a day where there's no artillery, or maybe the odd stray shell, but as you say, it's remarkable how the sources agree with one another, even if you're in different parts of the front. Just the artillery just isn't firing. The German artillery isn't firing. The Royal Artillery isn't firing. Everybody's, without any kind of prior agreement, has decided no artillery shelling today. And I think something else to add to this is, Ben's father mentioned this earlier on in his account, there's an expectation that Christmas is going to be a bit different. It's strange. It's going to be a bit different. And the army itself the British army is going to try and make it a bit different. There's going to be some extra rations delivered to most units on Christmas Day. There's plans to make an early postal delivery so people can receive letters from loved ones. There's the very famous Prince Mary Christmas tins are going to be distributed, which are going to have some treats in for the soldiers, which always welcome, especially chocolate and cigarettes in 1940. And so there's a sense that Christmas Day is going to be a little bit different, and there's going to be some treat element to it. But what I don't think anybody predicts is that there's going to be a truce, because just to go back to Ben's father's Christmas Eve account, yes, there'd been a localized truce, but it'd basically been a meeting between a sergeant and an unnamed, unknown German soldier in the middle of no man's land. Is this going to extend, or was that just a strange one-off in that slightly surreal atmosphere of Christmas Eve? And I think as dawn breaks, most soldiers are just happy that the sun's coming up and temperatures are going to rise a degree or two, and gradually that frost is going to slacken off. But I do think, Dan, that there's a bit of an air of expectation that something might happen on Christmas Day.
I think that's got to be the case if you look at it. There's something clearly unusual has happened the night before. The Germans have been, generally speaking, more friendly than previously. You've got this lack of artillery firing. You've got a lack of sniping. And there's a bit of goodwill within each other's own lines anyway. There are more gifts coming up. You've got this Christmas tin, Princess Mary Christmas tin, which comes up with tobacco and sweets and writing paper and this kind of thing. That's lifted the men's spirits. And so this kind of compounding effect of few little home treats coming up, an early postal delivery that morning, it is really helping the situation. You still got this big question about truce or no truce, and of course, those units that have opened rapid fire the evening before, very likely to experience anything there. In fact, we're going to see a number of guys killed in those sectors over the coming day. But in areas where you have had, like with Bairnsfather, a slight kind of slackening of hostilities, even if only a brief one, there may well be something different. And actually, if we follow on now with Bairnsfather, I think his words again paint that picture really well.
They do. And let's pick up the story very shortly after dawn from Bairnsfather. He remembered this. On Christmas morning, I awoke very early and emerged from my dugout into the trench. It was a perfect day. A beautiful, cloudless blue sky. The ground hard and white, fading off towards the woods in a thin, low-lying mist. It was such a day as is invariably depicted by artists on Christmas cards. The ideal Christmas day of fiction. Fancy all this hate, war, and discomfort on a day like this, I thought to myself. The whole spirit of Christmas seemed to be there, so much so that I remember thinking, this indescribable something in the air, this peace and goodwill feeling, surely will have some effect on the situation here today. And I wasn't far wrong. It did around us anyway, and I've always been so glad to think of my luck in firstly being actually in the trenches on Christmas Day, and secondly, being on the spot where quite a unique little episode took place. Everything looked merry and bright that morning. The discomfort seemed to be less somehow. They seemed to have epitomised themselves in intense, frosty cold. It was just the sort of day for peace to be declared. It would have made such a good finale. I should like to have suddenly heard an immense siren blowing. Everybody to stop and say, "What was that?" Siren blowing again. Appearance of a small figure running across the frozen mud, waving something. He gets closer. A telegraph boy with a wire. He hands it to me. With trembling fingers, I open it. War off. Return home. George R.I. Cheers! But no, it was a nice, fine day. That was all. Walking about the trench a little later, discussing the curious affair of the night before, we suddenly became aware of the fact that we were seeing a lot of evidences of Germans. Heads were bobbing about and showing over their parapet in a most reckless way, and as we looked, this phenomenon became more and more pronounced. A complete Boche figure suddenly appeared on the parapet and looked about itself. This complaint became infectious. It didn't take our Bert long to be up on the skyline. It is one long grind to ever keep him off it. This was the signal for more Boche anatomy to be disclosed, and this was replied to by all our Alfs and Bills, until in less time than it takes to tell, half a dozen or so of each other of the belligerents were outside their trenches and were advancing towards each other in no man's land. A strange sight, truly. I clambered up and over our parapet and moved out across the field to look. Clad in a muddy suit of khaki and wearing a sheepskin coat and balaclava helmet, I joined the throng about halfway across to the German trenches. It all felt most curious. Here were these sausage-eating wretches who had elected to start this infernal European fracas, and in doing so had brought us all into the same muddy pickle as themselves. This was my first real sight of them at close quarters. Here they were, the actual, practical soldiers of the German army. There was not an atom of hate on either side that day. And yet on our side, not for a moment was the will to war and the will to beat them relaxed. It was just like the interval between the rounds in a friendly boxing match. The difference in type between our men and theirs was very marked. There was no contrasting the spirit of the two parties. Our men, in their scratched costumes of dirty, muddy khaki, with their various assorted headdresses of woolen helmets, mufflers, and battered hats, were a light-hearted, open, humorous collection, as opposed to the sombre demeanour and stolid opinions of the Huns in their grey-green faded uniforms, top boots, and pork pie hats. And this is, of course, the start of what we would call the Christmas truce. And I think Bairnsfather paints a fantastic picture of how informal and unplanned all this is. He catches two things, I think, Dan, that are worth commenting on. One, that he wakes up with an expectation something's going to happen, and looking out across this white frosted scene, which, as he says, is like something from a Christmas card, captures a mood that I think a lot of soldiers have already got and are longing for. And then the truce itself is largely informal and largely driven by the Germans starting to appear on the trenches, as Bairnsfather describes, and British soldiers just responding in kind. You know, you don't need verbal communication to understand what is happening here. It must have been a pretty incredible sight.
I was just thinking back as Ben's father was describing that those first Germans kind of bobbing their head above the trench. That's a real key moment, that, because the British reaction at that very moment decides what goes on for the rest of the day. That's what sets the tone in my mind. Actually, it takes a fair amount of bravery or potentially even stupidity to be the first guy to stick your head above a trench there. You know, it's one thing to stick your head up and be the first person to institute a Christmas truce. But it will be something completely different if you were the first guy to stick your head up and just become the first casualty on Christmas Day 1914. Nobody wants to be that guy either. So actually, to test the water in that sense was quite a moment. And of course, when they find that, at least in the Plug Street sector, there are no shots coming back, that's when we get the birth of this truce, which actually ripples up and down much of the line to both north and south of Plug Street, which is really the heart of the truce in that area. And before long, we're going to see the same thing. Individual guys, half a dozen guys, a dozen guys, and then in some cases, entire companies, even battalions going out into no man's land. And we're going to see, really, in the hours of daylight, almost exclusively in the daylight hours, hundreds, if not thousands of men out in the middle of no man's land, shaking hands, eventually cutting each other's hair. Souveniring is probably the job of the day, with people going around trying to swap a button here or a coin there, even exchanging of addresses. There are several examples. How true they are, we don't know, but there was certainly a big German population in East London before the war. There are several examples of men actually knowing belligerents on the other side and meeting them in no man's land. So these kind of extraordinary incidents did happen. There were certainly English speakers within the German army, certainly more than there were German speakers within the British army. But we see all kinds of elements, and this is it's a really infectious, spontaneous moment that sees any number of remarkable things. Famously, down in the Bois Grenier sector, the Germans who've been billeted near a brewery managed to roll a keg of beer into no man's land, which was certainly very much appreciated. And we see lots of swapping of tobacco and things like this. It's interesting how Ben's father, in the previous segment and also in the next one we're going to cover, talks about the details of this standoffish approach and just how you might speak to the enemy, and how these men kind of warily regarded each other for a while. But there's also another element here, and I think this is one that's far too often overlooked when it comes to the story of the Christmas truce, and that's going back to this idea of burial services, because there are moments where you get extremely somber moments out in the front line. You get Tom in A Company has come out. Fair enough, there might be Germans over there, but to get to them, he's got to walk past his best mate who's missing half of his head. And these are the moments that a lot of those men are actually leaving their trenches for. There's in fact, there's an account here which I found just today when I was researching this subject, of someone who's out in no man's land. And they actually written back. It's an anonymous account, but they've written back discussing the story of that day. And I'll just read this little entry from a newspaper for you. A truce had been arranged for the few hours of daylight for the burial of the dead on both sides. The dead had been lying out in the open since the fierce night fighting of a week earlier. When I got out, I found a large crowd of officers and men, British and German, grouped around the bodies, which had already been gathered and laid out in rows. I went along those dreadful ranks and scanned the faces, fearing at every step to recognize one I knew. It was a ghastly sight. They lay stiffly in contorted attitudes, dirty with frozen mud and powdered with lime. The digging parties were already busy on the two big common graves, but the ground was hard and the work was slow and laborious. That gives a different flavour to this kind of joviality of that morning, Spence. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, though, because Ben's father, whilst this is going on only a few hundred yards from him, Ben's father is experiencing something very different.
This is a really good point. That in some places, the truce effectively breaks out because there's an unspoken, or in some cases, an indicated desire for burial parties to go out. And this applies to the Germans too. There are German dead lying in no man's land as well as British dead. And we have this part of the Christmas truce memory, the story has been largely lost, I think, in popular memory. It doesn't really fit with the spirit of Christmas. We want to be drawn to the idea of gift giving, hair cutting, kickabouts, which we've discussed in a previous episode on the Christmas truce. But in fact, for a substantial number, perhaps even the majority of British and German soldiers who are drawn into this, what they want to do is they want to go and retrieve their friends. And whether that's either side does this. And you read about burial parties moving up and down the line and just quietly collecting friends who've been killed in the previous weeks, days or previous weeks. Not pleasant work. These bodies frozen stiff in the early morning frost. Some have been there for a long time and are in a poor state. But this is what some people are going to spend their Christmas truce doing. And I dare say, Dan, that for some people, some soldiers, that's a lot more important than exchanging tobacco. There may be, and I've read this myself, there may be, as the burial parties move past each other, there may be some acknowledgement, there may be some exchanges there, but the mood of the burial parties is very different. They have a job to do. They want to retrieve their dead and take them back to have a proper burial. So there's that element to it too. And I think we've got to remember this, that although Christmas Day on parts of the front is an amazing experience, I think Ben's father's account captures this. For a lot of people involved in the truce, especially in the mid-morning and indeed going a little bit further on into the day, if we're carrying this 24 hours on, they're going to be actually looking for the dead. And it's tiring work, it's time-consuming work, but it's work that's very important to the soldiers of both sides.
Undoubtedly. And, we do see as well, mutual burial services. There's at least one British padre out there buries both British and Germans in the same grave. And we see these kind of informal moments. What's really interesting, I think, in a sense, and we'll see it in both sides here, and it's almost jarring, Spence, when you listen to it. We talked about Ben's father's kind of jovial, very humoristic style of exploring the story of the Christmas truce, and then we almost cut away to this idea of burial parties. And you think, well, that's kind of jarring to discuss it in those elements. The truth is, though, that happened next to each other on the same parts of the battlefield. We're talking about the same day, same part of the line. There were in one corner, there might be blokes shaking hands, slapping each other on the back, swapping buttons. Within eyesight, you've got a burial party going on. It's quite a shocking way to think of it. But there's also maybe an element here of that 3 or 4 months of pretty intense warfare having already blunted the senses to an extent where that's kind of acceptable. What do you think about that?
I think there's definitely truth in this. I think that there's in some ways, and I'm perhaps over expanding this, you can see the Christmas truce as a watershed moment between the British and the German army and the soldiers involved in this. For the soldiers who were involved and who survived the war, it could be a magical moment they long remembered, like Ben's father, like others who left us detailed accounts. But in another sense, this was the only time that this could possibly have happened. And it's a unique occurrence within the First World War. There are some Christmas truces, limited Christmas truces, on other parts of the front at other years of the war, but they basically become impossible after this time. And I think one of the reasons is that there's a variety of reasons. Trenches are more complicated. Barbed wire belts are now enormous. You can't actually approach each other's trenches. Lots and lots more firepower. But there's also an attitude has changed. By the end of 1915, France has suffered another million casualties. The British Army suffered some 60,000 casualties to add to this. The war's not going well for the Allies. The idea of fraternization is it just doesn't exist in the same way. And so I see a sort of one of the things that makes this so fascinating is this is the only time it could occur this way. And indeed, it is the only time it'll occur this way. And so it becomes this sort of perfect crystal that is unique, but it also represents the end of a world. From now on, there's going to be a lot more. Each Christmas is going to be, in some ways, harder than the last. More efforts to kill and destroy one another as the war goes on. More intensity, more commitment to fighting the war ever more ferociously. And so I think that's one of the reasons, actually, Dan, that this 24 hours gets remembered so vividly, because in the huge panoply of the First World War, on the Western Front alone, there's so much can happen. And on one level, this is just a strange day in a very long war. But on the other hand, for those men who live through it and who live long enough to discuss it afterwards, and they perhaps can, like Bairnsfather, they can look back on their military career, they can look back on the war. There's no day quite like this in the entire First World War.
It's truly unique, and there's no doubt about that. It's unique. Let's put it a different way. It's unique for those guys that actually take part in a physical truce, in a literal truce, because of course the backstory to this, or the other half of that coin, the other side of that coin, is of course it doesn't happen for everybody. In fact, if we were to break down, for every 100 guys on the front line, even in the British sector, which of course has much higher propensity for truces, if you were to break that down, less than 50 of every 100 are actually involved actively in a truce. Probably 50 of the remaining 60 or so are involved in a quiet stretch of the line with no fraternization, but pass their time with their mates fairly well. And then there are maybe 10 guys or so out of that 100 who are actively in a very hostile environment. In fact, people are killed. Two guys famously in the Hertfordshire Regiment, both shot by a sniper, Percy Huggins and Tom Gregory, on the morning of Christmas Day 1914. In fact, quick plug for that, recent release on the Battle Guide YouTube channel if you want to see not only that, but the actual location where Ben's father was on Christmas Day 1914. Check that out, because that video will cover in quite some detail. So it's certainly not universal, and that's really the story here. Of course, if you ask somebody in the street today and you said, "Right, tell me about the Christmas Truce 1914," everybody stopped fighting. They all got out of their trenches and had one giant football match. Well, the football match, that's a different story, perhaps for another day or another year. That one, Spence. Questionable. Certainly no formal football played. There may be somebody kick something in a generally round shape towards a German in an area that might be of no man's land. But let's go back to this burial idea. What are you playing football over? Where are you going to find a patch of ground? Are you using a dead guy as a goalpost? Of course not. You know, there's some practicality issues here as well. So let's not open that particular can of worms, Spence. It's just too dangerous and not enough time today. But of course, there is a legitimate truce, and that legitimate truce can be extremely powerful. And maybe we can go to Bruce Bairnsfather again to finish off or round off his experience of Christmas Day to kind of tell that part of the story.
I think that's a great idea, Dan. And just to echo what you've said, the Christmas Truce football match we have discussed previously. Perhaps we'll dedicate a full episode to it next Christmas. But for most men involved in the Christmas Truce, it's not. There just isn't the level of organization. There isn't the area to play a football match, and the real work is still quite cautious. And we heard about Bairnsfather talking about soldiers are a little bit cautious approaching each other on Christmas Eve and so forth. Then we of course talked at length about the burial parties, and there is a lot of destruction in no man's land, a lot of chaos in no man's land. It's not a nice flat parkland. It's not a great place for a game. But let's finish with Bairnsfather's final commentary on this, which I think really captures a lot about the Christmas Truce, and certainly a little bit about Bairnsfather as well. So he remembered this. The shortest effect I can give of the impression I had was that our men, superior, broad-minded, more frank and lovable beings, were regarding these faded, unimaginative products of perverted culture as a set of objectionable but amusing lunatics whose heads had got to be eventually smacked. Look at that one over there, Bill, Bert would say, as he pointed out some particularly curious member of the party. I strolled about amongst them all and sucked in as many impressions as I could. 2 or 3 of the Boches seemed to be particularly interested in me, and after they had walked round me once or twice with sullen curiosity stamped on their faces, one came up and said, "Officer?" I nodded my head, which means yes in most languages, and besides, I can't talk German. These devils, I could see, all wanted to be friendly, but none of them possessed the open, frank geniality of our men. However, everyone was talking and laughing and souvenir hunting. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant, I should think, and being a bit of a collector, I intimated to him that I had taken a fancy to some of his buttons. We both then said things to each other which neither understood and agreed to do a swap. I brought out my wire clippers and, with a few deft snips, removed a couple of his buttons and put them in my pocket. I then gave him 2 of mine in exchange. Whilst this was going on, a babbling of guttural ejaculations emanating from one of the lager shifters told me that some idea had occurred to someone. Suddenly, one of the Boches ran back to his trench and presently reappeared with a large camera. I posed in a mixed group for several photographs, and have ever since wished I had fixed up some arrangement for getting a copy. No doubt framed editions of this photograph are reposting on some hung mantelpieces, showing clearly and unmistakably to admiring strafers how a group of perfidious English surrendered unconditionally on Christmas Day to the brave Deutsches. Slowly, the meeting began to disperse. A sort of feeling that the authorities on both sides were not very enthusiastic about this fraternising seemed to creep across the gathering. We parted, but there was a distinct and friendly understanding that Christmas Day would be left to finish in tranquillity. The last I saw of this little affair was a vision of one of my machine gunners, who was a bit of an amateur hairdresser in civil life, cutting the unnaturally long hair of a docile Boche, who was patiently kneeling on the ground whilst the automatic clippers crept up the back of his neck. And what this captures is a question we often get asked, and that's, how did the Christmas truce actually end? Well, it ended just as it had begun, largely by mutual consent, and the Christmas truce fraternisation begins pretty soon after dawn, early in the morning, as Bairnsfather's related, and starts to peter out around about mid-afternoon, and there's no great signal for this. Just gradually some people start returning to their trench. Perhaps they've had enough of standing about. Perhaps they want to get some food or maybe try and get some sleep or some rest, and gradually, as one person goes, another one sees him go, and gradually that no man's land sort of empties by mutual consent, Dan.
Yeah, an unusual way to finish an unusual day, actually, and but perhaps quite fitting in the same sense, as you say, fairly spontaneous. Nobody's blowing a whistle and telling men to get back in their trenches. Of course, this is not sanctioned by senior officers, and for obvious reasons. Much harder to kill the guy on the line opposite if you know he's got a wife and kids, because you were chatting to him 2 days before. So senior officers really stamped down on this. Part of the reason why there's no future truces of any kind. But also, that the lads just want to get back. They've kind of had that, if you like, novelty experience, and I wonder if there's just a kind of a slight sense that yeah, we probably shouldn't be out here. And actually, as darkness starts to come around, which is fairly early in December in that part of the world, men head back into their trench. We know that from different areas of the line, there are different signals. In some cases, somebody will deliberately fire off a little volley of rounds or a couple of gunshots. In others, actually, peace will last for even a couple of days more. Some of these guys, I think, rather naively will come back, and you get the impression it must have been really young lads. Oh, let's come back out and have a game of football. So this whole football idea, despite saying we're going to ignore that, quite a lot of the accounts that you hear of football are people saying, we arranged with the Bosch in no man's land to play a game on Boxing Day. And of course, that never eventuates. There's no fraternization on Boxing Day. There may be quiet zones and there may be friendly shouts across no man's land, but there's not the sense that there was the day before. And really, by the time we get to about midnight on Christmas Eve into Boxing Day, the Christmas truce is pretty much over, but forever stamped in the memories of those who were there.
One thing just to add some weight to this, troops go back in the British sector into their trenches by this mutual consent, and all they can do is talk about what's just happened. And this is where a lot of these ideas, there might be some hand signals as the troops are starting to part. We'll come back and we'll play on Boxing Day. Some of the younger soldiers, some of the more naive soldiers might be thinking it's going to be like this all through the Christmas period. Certainly in Britain, Boxing Day was a big celebration in the First World War period. It was second only to Christmas, really. So some British soldiers perhaps anticipating it's going to be exactly like this and hoping for this. And the soldiers themselves, the mood is buoyant, even though the conditions are still miserable. It's still cold. The trenches are still flooded and waterlogged. But there's a sense that something magical's happened, even in the later afternoon, when, for the most part, everybody's back in their trenches. And as evening sets in, there's still some singing going on. German singing, British singing, some musical accompaniments to all this, not unlike it had been on Christmas Eve, almost a sort of the curtain falling on this really unusual Christmas day. And you made a good point, Dan, that when Boxing Day comes around, it's a very quiet day for most parts of the Anglo-German sector. Very little artillery, if any. There's still an air of peace. But that strange combination of factors that had led to the fraternization is not going to be repeated. There might be one or two shouts, one or two waves from the trenches, but that magical, just by mutual consent of getting back into no man's land isn't going to occur. And there's a variety of reasons why. I think that on one hand, I think a lot of people recognize that Christmas Day was totally unique. On the other hand, I think there's also, and certainly this is true on the British side, there's a bit of a clamping down on this and saying, don't do that again. It's happened, we can't change it, but we do not want fraternization again for the reasons you've outlined, Dan. It's very hard to kill somebody when you've been, cutting his hair the previous day and sharing photographs with him. So there's a clamping down on this, and this goes back to the uniqueness of the Christmas truce. And just as we come to sort of round this off, one thing to remember is the Christmas truce doesn't exist everywhere. We've mentioned this previously, that there are a number of soldiers who actually get killed on Christmas Day. And I think sometimes the image that the entire Western Front stops and celebrates Christmas Day makes us forget that soldiers are killed. And I've certainly had the experience out on the Western Front explaining this to people when touring the Western Front, and they've been absolutely shocked that people are killed on Christmas Day in 1914. Well, weren't they all having a Christmas truce? Well, of course, that's not the case.
Yeah, if you take the total numbers, and we can only be extremely precise from research I've done at least about British. So if you look at Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which covers British and Commonwealth casualties, and you search for 25th of December 1914, there are about 140 men that lose their lives that day. If we were taking approximatives, you would say perhaps 40 of those are going to die of wounds, having been wounded in days and weeks previously. There'll be a handful of accidents and various other things. But we know there are at least 70 guys that are going to be killed in action in various different forms up and down the Western Front that day. So it's certainly not a bloodless day. And if you were to take those numbers and extrapolate them to the French and the Germans, it's probably the same order of magnitude. So for hundreds of families, hundreds of them, Christmas Day 1914 is just another brutal day of war on the Western Front.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Not quite so much Bully and
McConaughey.
Third time. Fourth time. McConaughey. I was billed to appear at fifth time. We're going to get there. I'm not going to give up.